Arts in Santa Fe Art Institute. Exhibiting nationally and internationally, his work has been shown in Russia, Japan, France, and throughout galleries in New York, Chicago, San Francisco, Denver, Salt Lake City, and Miami. Buffalo Hyde's work is dynamic and engages in the miscommunications between Indigenous people and popular culture, dealing with issues of appropriation and commodification. His paintings are in museum collections such as the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian, the Autry Museum of the American West, and the Museum of Contemporary Native Art in Santa Fe. Most recently, he has contributed to programming at the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian in New York and the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C. Buffalo Hyde has also had a solo exhibition at the Google campus in Boulder, Colorado. Courtney M Leonard is a Shinnecock artist and filmmaker whose work examines marine biology, indigenous food sovereignty, migration, and human environmental impact. Leonard's current projects articulate the multiple definitions of the term breach and investigate and document indigenous communities' historical ties to water, marine life, and native cultures of subsistence. In collaboration with national and international museums, embassies, and cultural institutions and local Indigenous communities in North America, New Zealand, and Nova Scotia, Leonard's practice centers around narratives of cultural viability and relationships between Indigenous people and the environmental record. Leonard's work is in the permanent collections of the United States Art Embassy Program, the Crocker Art Museum, the Heard Museum, the ASU Art Museum and Ceramic Research Center, the Peabody Essex Museum, the Newark Museum, the Wiseman Art Museum, the Nerman Museum of Contemporary Art, the Newark Museum, I already said that, and the Museum of the Mystic Seaport Museum, the Pomona Museum of Art, the Hood Museum of Art, and the Denver Museum of Art, as well as the Autry Museum and the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. Leonard has received numerous awards, fellowships, residencies from the Andy Warhol Foundation, the Robert Rauschenberg Foundation, the Rasmussen Foundation, and the United States Art and Embassies Program, and the Native Arts and Cultural Foundation. So now I'm going to turn it over to Frank, who will do a presentation on his work, and then we'll hear from Courtney as well, and have a little bit of time for discussion. So I hope everybody enjoys the program, and thanks again for tuning in.
Hello.
Thanks, Frank. We can hear you.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Frank Buffalo Hyde, Onondaga Nation Beaver Clan. And we're going to take a look at a few slides of my work. This first slide is from the Epoch series. The Epoch show was in Santa Fe, I think in 2019. And it was a survey of Americana. I was investigating like where the lines of Americana and Native Americana delineated, because after all, there's nothing more Americana than Indigenous people. So I was sort of investigating those themes, and this is Epoch's American Idol #1, I believe, or #2. But it's a subtle parallel between, what people have accepted and reinforced as, Indigenous iconography paired with popular culture. And I just kind of wanted to see like what would happen if any Indigenous performers were highlighted on that show. Slide. Here's another iteration of that. This is sort of an offshoot of another series that I did, which was Eyewitness Culture. And Eyewitness Culture was a show that I did in Santa Fe at the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture that's currently traveling around the country. And it dealt with the how we've all become sort of separated from our reality and our digital selves. And that's even seems to be more a apparent in culture. Like when people go on vacation or they tour the Southwest, is, you know, everybody wants to have the video of the dance demonstrations, and it really just kind of takes them away from actually experiencing what they went to see in the first place. So this is another imagination of what that would look like if an Indigenous performer was highlighted on American Idol. And this is a Oneida dancer. I used my cousin Heath Hill as a model with permission. Slide. This is also from the Epoch show, and the epochs by definition is, you know, a certain period of time, and so I extrapolated that into art history and popular culture, and sort of wanted to see what it would look like if certain sections of art history were mashed up with popular culture and things that I've been exposed to growing up. And this piece is called "Sippin' on a Caesar." It's sort of a play on a song and a portrait of Caesar. And it was, you know, the show was a real breakthrough for me for a couple reasons. One was that I had a long time. Usually with gallery shows, I have less than a year to prepare. This one I started working on a full year in advance. So it really allowed me to edit the show and to make it a cohesive grouping. And it was over 3/4 of the show was purchased by the Tia collection. So that's, you know, another thing that ended up happening because of the show, which is, you know, pretty awesome. Slide. This is another Epoch's piece. This is called "I Know You Are, But What Am I?" And somebody was mentioning to me about portraiture, and I was thinking, I don't really make portraits, but then they sort of, they responded like, yes, you totally make portraits, maybe not in the conventional way, but you do. So when I was growing up, Pee Wee Herman was, you know, pretty prevalent. You know, this was pre movie theater incident. So, you know, I had the dolls and watched the TV show. And so the Epochs was also an investigation of, you know, what would make me like unique. And I've said this over and over again, is like, art is not really, you know, that complicated. You know, painting's not that complicated. It's pigment on two-dimensional planes. But what makes us unique is like what takes place between our ears and our own experiences. So I started to really investigate my own narrative and started, you know, digging back to experiences and my own icons growing up. Slide. This is Epoch's 1979. And this is a portrait of one of my prized possessions in 1979 was a little rubber Batman figure that I got from Walgreens. And that same year, there was a gas shortage. So people would get odd or even days to go fill up their tanks. And so I remember going with my mom, packing a lunch and waiting in line for gas. And I always had all my action figures with me. And I like one time noticed that I lost my Batman and I still haven't found him. So I thought I would just repaint him and sort of maybe soothe some of my separation anxiety. And I'm pretty sure that's where it all started. Slide. This is an investigation of another series that I started, the Buffalo Burger series. Bison in North America, buffalo, were pushed to the point of extinction in the 1800s. And they're now coming back in large numbers as a low-fat beef alternative. So I imagine kind of what that would look like. You know, people were like, oh yeah, the buffalo are coming back, but you know, why are they coming back? Because people are eating them. So I just kind of wanted to illustrate that in a way that would be, I mean, if you take a look at the series, it's evolved from a very static portrait to like these sandwiches actually move as if they're falling from the sky. So people are, you know, have really strong reactions to any of these pieces. They're all like, oh yeah, or they're like, oh no, why would you eat that? But you know, that's where meat comes from. Slide. This was another offshoot of what happened during the Epoch's investigations show. Was I started painting toys and maybe racist icons I had growing up as toys. So I started to make these Pez figures, and then once I made the Pez figures, I started to have them interact together as if they're like in a preservation, in a Western theme, and combining these really painterly art marks and just trying to make them interesting. I mean, that's really what a lot of my work is about. Is the work has to be interesting for me, number one, and then if it's not interesting for me, it's really not going to do anything for you either. And my work isn't about Native Americans being fetishized. It's not there for collectors to placate their guilt or fulfill any sort of preconceived notions of what Native Americans are or what contemporary Native American art is. Slide. This is the current iteration of my Hopi cheerleader series. The first Hopi cheerleaders in my work showed up in the mid-90s, and they were really dark figures. They're kind of like Bacon-esque figures. There was no detail. There was just dark figures with teeth, and they're arranged in different sort of ominous like pyramids. And so over the years, it's evolved into these Hopi cheerleaders moving in like acrobatic ways, and this is like the 2021 version of it, where in my mind, growing up in the Southwest in the summertime, I got to see how the sort of Hopi maiden became this icon in culture tourism, and come to the Southwest and buy art. So in my warped imagination, I started seeing this Hopi maiden as a cheerleader for tourism and contemporary Native art. Slide. So recently we've relocated to southern Minnesota, and our studio's in Red Wing, Minnesota, and we were able to find a pretty amazing warehouse space. So I'm starting to push the scale of my work. I think these are 60 by 72 inches. And this is part of Virtual Sovereignty series. This is number 4, I think, 3 or 4. I'm not sure. I always get them flip-flopped. But what it's about is I've read something online about virtual reality or social media being akin to the wild, wild west. It's really by and large unregulated. And we saw the effects of that in the previous election and even the one that just happened. So it really sort of got me thinking about all of these Western themes, all of the manifest destiny in the virtual world and all of these cowboys and Indian scenarios. So I started to go back, and I intentionally chose the Curtis photos because they're the ultimate appropriated images and posed images. And then I, paralleled them with the Oculus virtual reality paraphernalia, because if you've ever been in virtual reality, it's pretty amazing. I grew up in the era of Nintendo and Sega, and to be able to not just play the video games but be in the video games, it's pretty mind-blowing. And it's I'll have to admit it's continuing to influence my work. And slide. This is another current piece. I was telling Aaron earlier that these are current pieces I finished at least 2 or 3 days ago, and so I'm still processing them. I really do like them. What's different about these pieces is the scale, but also when you're working on something this size, I hope to push the size even more. I'm sort of slowly gathering steam for a major solo exhibition in a couple years that I can't really talk about yet, but I'm going to be pushing the size of my work, and it really makes a difference of how you make paintings and how you put them together if you're working on a different scale. So it's interesting for me to see how it's changing my work. And also I've gotten to a point where I'm allowing myself to just make the paintings that are popping in and not editing before they come into the world. I'm giving myself the permission to, get out of my own way. And so this is basically where my work is right now. Yeah, I think that's it. Slide.
Thank you so much, Frank. So now we're going to turn it over to Courtney and hear a little bit more about her practice, and then we.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me, and excited to be here and share my work. You're welcome to change the slide to the next one. Thank you. So for the past 5 or 6 years, I'm Shinnecock from Long Island, New York, and our community, Shinnecock in our language translates to people of the level land or people of the shore. And when I was living back home, topics, conversations about climate change and issues are very prevalent now, but they weren't necessarily discussed as much about 10 years or so ago. I think it comes in waves in terms of decades and conversations in regards to that. But when you're living very close to the water, you don't have a choice in terms of when you enter into those conversations or not. And specifically, if you're from an Indigenous community that is a coastal community. And I say that in relationship to watching your waters rise and when people want to deny your truth. And I think that's what led me into the work that I've been investigating and researching in a cross-cultural connected way amongst other Indigenous communities that also share coastlines through the word breach. So English is a very fascinating language. You can have one word and multiple definitions of entering into that word. And I came upon breach and thinking about our relationship as Shinnecock people to our water, our land, and our histories. So our men were hired onto the Yankee whaling boats, the tall ships during the 1700s, 1800s, and also taught a lot of the colonial people to be seafarers and to live off the land and to also be able to survive in that specific territory on the east end of Long Island. And so breach is this combination of looking at that history, but also our present issues. And within that definition, breach is an act of breaking or failing to observe law. It's an agreement or code of conduct. It's a gap in a wall or barrier. And it's also the whale as it rises through the surface of the water. This image here is from a series I called Artifice, which I often take one English word from the relationship of looking at water and coastal issues. And so Artifice is looking at man-made coastal erosion projects, but this specific piece is made out of micaceous clay. It's coiled and it's in reference to that raw material and land and water and place. Next. People often ask artists when they've begun a work or how long they've been an artist or where their ideas come from. I think in response to that, a lot of it has to do with it's an ongoing process from birth. You have a constant relationship. And I say that in regards to the first time that I had actually been with a whale myself was in 2005. This 40-ton, 50-foot finback whale had been struck by a shipping boat, and its body had washed ashore on the dune roadside, which faces the Atlantic Ocean, where most of the wealthy Hampton homes are. And then when you cross that inlet into Shinnecock Bay, then our reservation is on Shinnecock Neck, which faces the bay and then there's Dune Road, and then there's the Atlantic Ocean. So when that occurred, we were not federally recognized, we were state recognized. We received federal recognition in 2010 through President Obama's administration. And that has a lot to do with the politics of sovereignty, subsistence harvesting. One whale would feed us traditionally through winter, previous to whaling being banned. And so this piece is called Breach Number 2. It marks the idea of accessibility, of being able to have cultural material to that of the whale. And it represents a sperm whale, 48 to 60 teeth on a shipping pallet. So it also is symbolic of production and import and export and trade, and the acknowledgement that the majority of whales struck per year are actually killed by our shipping industries. Next. And this is just a detail of the piece. The piece is also made out of clay. It is reflective of a material that I do have access to without the imposition of an outside nation telling us as Indigenous people what we can and cannot do. This has been my offset within my studio space, is to work within the material of clay and earth. Next. I have also another ongoing series that's hubbed under Breach. I realized when I first did the Breach exhibition in maybe 2014 that I wasn't done in thinking through this word and my response to it. So I began to call Breach a logbook series. So there's logbook 2014, looking at the call and response of what was happening to the environment I was witnessing in 2014. I've also done logbook 15 all the way up through my most recent is logbook 2020. Through those logbooks, I have different bodies of work. I mentioned artifice, but then this series is called Abundance, which is a part of the physical digital exhibition and collection at the Heard Museum. This is looking at mass fish dies, our issues of not being able to harvest both our fish and also our shellfish during certain warming seasons when we have nitrogen runoff and toxic shellfish issues. So there's kind of a stagnant period of time where we're not allowed to harvest. So I was thinking about clay as a material that once fired to a certain degree holds strength, but it also, depending on how it's fashioned, can be fragile, just as fragile as the environment that it is coming from. And so these baskets are not functional. They hang often on installations that I do referencing land and water contour elevation mapping lines. And it's also in reference to being from New England, where often if you're not using your basket, you hang it on the wall to dry. And that was where I was responding to this body of work. Next. These pieces are also all coiled and hand-built. And often I'm installing on 30 to 50-foot wall spaces. Next. This was also looking at the notion of a combination of breach, looking at the sperm whale teeth, but also thinking about our shell dresses and our traditional dresses where we would have the shells kind of as this account or count of presence. So looking at the breach piece that I had mentioned previously, often people don't realize how many teeth are in a pile. So in this reflection, this is called a count. It spans about 13 by 13 feet of a bed of sand. And it also is in reverence to something that's washed ashore, and also looking at our adornment and dresses from like this topical aerial perspective. So these are all the sperm whale teeth in that account arrangement. On the right and left-hand side are flanking systems that are an extension of the Artifice series, and those are also looking at man-made coral reef structures. That particular body is made out of raw clay and often deconstructed and reconstructed as a part of the installations. Next. I am honored to be able to do this work, and I found that often as an Indigenous community that many people have not quite heard about, that how do you get people to hear when you potentially are under issues of your territory falling into water? I found that the best way to go about doing it was to learn and listen and have an understanding. So I've been fortunate enough to travel and engage and collaborate with other Indigenous communities, following the path of my ancestors on those Yankee whaling boats, up to Mi'kmaq territory in Nova Scotia, and then out to Inupiaq territory in the North Slope, and New Zealand in Aotearoa with my Maori friends. And we all stay in relationship with one another. And so I hold a lot of responsibility to how we all can be collectively heard. This particular installation is an invitation that I had received to work with Pomona College and their collection. And in that regard, I found this, I found a couple of things. The trade system of shells in relationship to being an Eastern person is often prevalent anywhere you go with coastal communities. And so I don't think often that our societies as Indigenous people are acknowledged as being also a part of trade and gathering and subsistence and resilience. So I was looking at this burden basket that was in the collection, and I felt that the word burden was not necessarily an Indigenous concept. When you carry something, you don't carry it with the weight of it being a burden. You're helping and assisting to feed your community. So I wove that into a new series of baskets that I call my burden studies. And they're a combination of also fish traps and that conical like amplification. But that other image that I'm sharing is the import and export coming out of Southern California ports, and the majority of US goods are on those boats. So if you look at ship strikes and unfortunate situations with whales who have passed, you'll often see it in port communities, Southern California, as well as New England and New York systems. Next. Currently, Nebulous is the iteration of Logbook 20 that is installed at the Hood Museum. This work I made just before the pandemic began and the airports closed. I installed it and finished March 7th, and then was able to fly back home to, at the time I was living in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And this is looking at ghost traps, and then specifically the Connecticut River as it flows from the north down into Long Island Sound and then towards our community. And those ghost traps and the detritus of man-made figures, either pipes, filtration systems, traps. Next. And also the dam systems are what inspired the forms that I created for this exhibition. I'm always making new work. If I get the invitation, I really need to honor the place and have an understanding of how breach fits within that space. And I don't sign my work. That's something that I'm adamant about. It's all breach, and it's all collective understanding of the communities that are a part of breach. This series is looking at crab traps as well as the geometry of the space of the dam, the Wilder Dam by Dartmouth's campus. Next. I will often include video components to kind of add to the understanding, the visual understanding, and the sound acoustics that are part of breach in terms of sound traffic that species have been impacted by. The specific media installation is in the shape of a bivalve oyster shell and or the representative of the whale tail. It's a dual projection showing harvesting of oyster traps and then the Wilder Dam as it opens up with weaving in of whales as they're caught in the crab trap lines. And you can see on the right-hand side an egret that has been perched upon a ghost trap left behind off of Montauk. Next. Next. I did this work and research, and I often travel a lot, and I realized with the pandemic, I didn't really have a lot of experience in being still. And I, over the past year, haven't made a lot of ceramic work up until recently. But with transition to the new studio space, I had begun to look at how Shinnecock, how our landscape was being documented. If you Google Shinnecock, William Merritt Chase often comes up rather than our Shinnecock artists that are holding our own conversations of land and territory. And it has to do with a school that he built in our territory in the late 1800s. So in thinking about place, I started this series called Collider. There is a ion collider being built at Brookhaven Lab on Long Island, very close to some of my family. And I was just thinking about the notions of collision during this time and healing. And so I'm also looking at plants and medicine as components of the series, specifically poppies, which were also brought by the Dutch. And this is a work in progress, Collider number 1. The red tones in William Merritt Chase's paintings are things that I am using as inspiration markers, but not necessarily giving a lot of weight to William aside from that. Next. And this specific piece is a juvenile humpback whale that was struck by a shipping boat in about 10 years ago. Its name is Tofu, and it's housed at a marine science center in New Hampshire. Next. Also in terms of resiliency, because I know that what I deal with is not necessarily enlightening in terms of notions of joy, but I think that the work as Indigenous people that all of us collectively do is a way of documenting our time. So I thought a lot about that in terms of the pandemic as well, and notions of resiliency. And I started another series with images that my daughter had taken after the residencies that I had been on for research, or ones that I had taken of her in the joy that she expressed being in the water. So I think sometimes it's important for us to remind ourselves about components of joy and resiliency and futurism. And so thank you to Bootney for having me here.
Just one moment. I'm trying to get my video to start. It seems to be. There we go. Well, thank you both so much for taking us through some images of your work. It really does help, I think, both our audience and for me as a curator. It's always so wonderful to hear directly from the artists themselves about their thought process and the sort of physical process of the way in which they create their work. And one thing that I started to think about while you were speaking, Courtney, just sort of about both of your practices, are these ideas of change or of crisis, and this idea of climate. And your work is very centered on and deals with sort of environmental climate change, sort of the natural world's climate change. And in some ways, Frank, your work seems to really investigate these ideas of cultural climate change or cultural climate shift. And it's, I think, really interesting to see how those intersect and manifest in very different ways in both of your practices. But it was just something that sort of spoke to me. And one thing that I'd like to ask, I guess I'll start with you, Frank, is sort of on that idea of cultural climate change. You spoke a little bit about the sort of depiction in your work of digital technologies such as the virtual reality, or in the pieces with the American Idol imagery, there are cell phones and people being, you know, documenting and filming, that you're sort of in a meta way documenting in the paintings. And what do you think the sort of long-term impact of sort of humanity's reliance on technology, or looking at the world through this filtered lens of iPhones or Twitter, or Instagram, and why is it so important to put in your work? Sorry if that was a very long question.
I think my video's frozen, but can you hear me?
Yes, and you are in motion. I can see you
okay.
as well.
Well, the effects of that actually have already happened. I mean, we're having a whole generation of people that don't know how to talk to each other. I mean, if you're traveling and you strike up a conversation with a stranger, hold open a door for somebody, say please, say thank you. These are subtle things that we grew up with as, you know, being part of a society, and they're being lost. I mean, Indigenous people are sort of, you know, have that greater society and then their own Indigenous communities to deal with. So, I mean, we're going to a spot where people have lost the nuance of experience, and that's the nuance of conversation. That's the nuance of the slight gesture of, you know, body language. And that's all been digitized, and everything is very terse, and it's upfront, and it's right away. And if you don't get it now, then I'm not interested in it. So it's, you know, it's dangerous. I mean, it's a dangerous path to go. And with this technology, I always say that it's amazing because it's kept people alive. It's amazing because it's reported news. It's disseminated information instantaneously, but also it's dangerous because who's controlling that information? And we saw that with, you know, the propaganda, you know, of what the U.S. is embroiled in now. And it's, so it's a double-edged sword, and it's, you know, I don't take myself out of that equation. I'm not better than anyone else. I'm right there with my phone every day, all day, reading all the garbage too. So, you know, it's, once I decided that painting cell phones at all was art, everything else became art. I mean, it's, you know, the artist's job is to document their time on this planet, and that's it. And that's all I'm really doing.
Absolutely. Well, and it's, you know, like to your point, it's become such a ingrained part of our daily lives, to where sometimes the first thing we do when we wake up in the morning is, you know, we're checking the time, or we're checking our notifications on our phone before we even get up and look out the window, or, you know, experience the actual world around us. So it's definitely, as you said, it's a dangerous thing if we don't keep it in balance. Right. And balance, of course, is something that is very important in the natural world as well. And it's, I think the piece that has, even when we had our little run through yesterday, that struck me so much, Courtney, is the nebulous piece that's at the hood. Well, not really a piece, it's more, you know, it's an installation, almost like an exhibition in and of itself. And it's, number one, it's visually arresting, the richness of the blues that you've incorporated. And I think that's also something that's very interesting about your work, that perhaps some people who have seen sort of individual objects or smaller pieces don't realize that you create these immersive environments. And it's sort of this environment about the environment, which is very interesting. And can you tell us a little bit about more that process when you're working with an institution or a curator and you're given this space to create a work? Did you already have that piece in its entirety sort of mapped out? Or, as you said, it seems like it's responsive to the environment and the community that you're working within?
So no, I think I'm fortunate enough that people believe in the work that I'm doing and invite me to a conversation. And I think if you're going to be in a conversation, you can't already know what you're going to say. You have to have a dialogue, or in some communities, we have dances that are referred to as like stomp dances. It's this call and response where someone calls out and then the response is returned. Mm-hmm. In that regard, specifically for the Hood Museum, Jamie Powell had invited me as a part of the exhibition extension form and relation to specifically do a response with breach and a logbook. when I was up there, in terms of the color field that I incorporated as a part of thinking through ghost traps, thinking through Long Island, and just the Connecticut River, how do we connect as going north to south along the eastern seaboard? There were tones of granite on the outside of the Hood Museum that evoked intimacy of the blue. In that combined, they were gray tones, but if you look really closely at color, you see other fields. And I think that happens in the basket forms as well. I'm making all my glazes. There are about 4 different layers. So I hope that people have intimate moments when they're observing land and place. And those are things that I try to navigate into the installations. But it was also in parallel to when you dive deep in the water, those blue tones are also there. And that installation afforded me an opportunity to go up and down the stairs. So it actually is like a 30 or 40 foot wall on a stairwell, and then it wraps the space. And so how do you make immersion as if you're either going into the depth or rising to the surface? And that was all a part of my decision-making for that space, and often my decision-making for other spaces. So the burden baskets were in an exhibition called Intermodal at Pomona. That was reflective of looking at red iron oxide tonality of cave work by ancestors of Tongva people on Catalina Island, and how do we map as Indigenous people our presence through time. The red iron oxide is prevalent through a lot of raw materials in place. So that's why I chose that color field for that specific place, which was an installation that was more cave-like. So space and environment, I think, is needed to get people to hear or understand what you are evoking as a part of your memory. Because if you're having these conversations and people are disengaged from them, how do you bring them into that memory? So those are things that I consider.
Absolutely. Oh, and I love what you said earlier about, you know, the clay is of the earth. It is a you know, organic material, and it has this strength, but it also has this fragility, which, you know, that I think it can be very much said about the earth itself. You know, it is a strong entity, but it's also, you know, even here in the desert, you know, the desert landscape is quite fragile. And I think people forget that and forget to sort of honor that in the way that, you know, the cities expand or contract and sort of life expands and contracts. So I love the use of that materiality in your work and the way you integrate these environments and these color fields, and even the projection. I think it adds so many layers of richness to the experience that the viewer has when entering one of those spaces. Well, I think I will turn it over to Allison and see what questions we may have from our viewers.
Thank you, Erin. So the first question that I have, and again, everybody, if you want to put it in the Q&A function or the comments, I'll be kind of going through each of those. And the first question I have is for both of you, with you both in Minnesota, you know, do you have any shows that are coming up locally?
No.
No.
Oh.
We're working towards deadlines in different parts of the country, but we're still very much getting the lay of the land and introducing ourselves to the community, and sort of, you know, just sort of easing into the situation. Moving during a pandemic was no small feat, and I think we're still recovering from that in a lot of ways. But we're also very blessed to have a great space to forge on and make new work. And yeah, I mean, that's, what do you think, Courtney?
I wasn't quite sure if the audience might know that we are married.
Are we?
So for those of you who are not familiar, Frank Buffalo Hyde is my husband, and we are both collectively in Minnesota, sharing a huge studio space, and are very mindful of how COVID has affected our communities. So we're working in more, and this kind of is fitting to what brought us here today in the digital realm. So we're having a lot of opportunities in terms of support through sales virtually and doing virtual exhibitions and transitioning in that regard until the time is right.
Thank you. And then I just had this other question for Frank, you know, the drippings on your paintings, and is there any sort of greater significance with those?
That's really funny because that's one of something I say in my art talks is, you know, that's a question that Cy Twombly would never get. And yeah, it's my great grandfather's special scribble passed down.
Well, if anyone else has any questions, now is the time. I'm also going to go ahead and drop the link to the digital exhibition in the comments. So if anyone wants to go check out these works, you can do so there. Otherwise, just give it another minute. But thank you both so much for joining us this afternoon. Really appreciated hearing all about your work and your practice. And it's just so wonderful to get to talk to you, especially during this time. It is such a unique experience, and still being able to connect with your artwork in this way has been really special. So thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. So with that, I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up. And so just go ahead and visit that website so you can see the work. Again, with Courtney's pieces, they're really amazing. They were photographed on the turntable. So if you just wait a moment for the page to load, you'll see them in the full 360-degree round. It's really, really great there. And thank you. And definitely take a moment to take that survey when you close out the webinar. So thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care.